For most of us, the runway feels like the safest part of flying. Yet, again and again, the worst seconds in American aviation have happened right there, on that strip of pavement.
You said thrust, please.
Thrust.
It's weird with no lights.
Yeah. Good one, Russ. Hey, whoa! Fuck!
In this video, we're staying at the edge of the asphalt, inside the towers and cockpits, to see how wrong turns, short runways, and simple assumptions turned familiar American airports into the scenes of the most terrifying runway disasters ever recorded. On the morning of August 27, 2006, most people in Lexington were still asleep when a small regional jet taxied out at Bluegrass Airport for the first departure of the day. Comair Flight 5191 was a short, familiar run to Atlanta, a Bombardier regional jet with 47 passengers and 3 crew members on board. It was still dark before sunrise, the ramp lights casting small pools on the pavement, the runways stretching away into the black. Bluegrass Airport had 2 runways. Runway 22 was over 7,000 feet long, fully equipped for jet departures. Runway 26 was only 3,500 feet, used mainly by small general aviation aircraft, and at that hour, effectively dark. The tower cleared the flight for takeoff from runway 22. With that length and the cool morning air, the jet had more than enough room to lift off and climb toward Georgia. The trouble began as soon as the airplane started to move. During taxi, the captain and first officer drifted into casual conversation. Life outside the cockpit. Below 10,000 feet and on the ground, airline crews are supposed to follow sterile cockpit rules. No non-essential talk, so everyone's attention stays on where the airplane is. That morning, in the dark, at an airport where taxiways had recently been changed, that loss of focus mattered. The crew followed what felt like the usual path and turned onto the first strip of pavement that looked like a runway. That pavement was runway 26. There were clues. The compass heading did not match runway 22. The lighting was different. The runway ended closer than expected to the airport perimeter. On the cockpit voice recorder, one pilot comments on how dark it seems ahead.
It's weird with no lights.
Yeah. Good one, Russ. Hey, whoa! Fuck!
In the tower, there was only one controller on duty. He had cleared the flight for runway 22 and watched it taxi out. After issuing the takeoff clearance, he turned away to handle paperwork and did not see the jet turn onto the wrong runway. At the end of runway 26, with only half the length they believed they had, the crew began the takeoff roll. Thrust came up. The jet accelerated into the darkness. The airspeed climbed. Nothing on the instruments told them they were on the wrong concrete. The airplane does not know how long the runway is. As they approached rotation speed, the captain called to lift off. The first officer pulled back on the column, but there was hardly any runway left. The jet had not reached flying speed, and the end of the pavement was already rushing toward them. The aircraft shot past the final markings, still low and heavy, and ran off into the grass. Beyond the concrete was a low berm, and then the airport perimeter. The jet hit the berm, briefly became airborne as it bounced, then struck a fence and a line of trees. The fuselage tore apart. Fire broke out. Of the 50 people on board, 49 were killed. Only the first officer survived. The investigation focused on a simple question. How did a professional crew try to take off from a runway obviously too short for their airplane? The board concluded that the probable cause was the crew's failure to use available cues to identify their position and verify they were on the correct runway. They had a compass, an airport diagram, signs, markings, and their own knowledge of the field. None were used the way procedures expect. Contributing factors: the casual conversation that violated sterile cockpit rules, recent changes to the airport layout, runway 26 being physically accessible and aligned close enough to feel about right in the dark, and the single controller on duty, working on limited sleep, who could not act as a backstop. After Lexington, federal regulators required explicit runway verification before every takeoff. Airports improved signage and lighting to make wrong runway turns harder, and the industry added this crash to the short list of accidents that should never have been possible, but happened anyway, because 2 pilots stopped paying attention at exactly the wrong moment. By the evening of August 16, 1987, Northwest Airlines Flight 255 was almost at the end of a long day. The MD-82 had started in Minnesota, stopped in Michigan, and now sat at Detroit preparing for its final leg to Phoenix and then California. On board were 149 passengers and 6 crew members, families heading home from summer trips, business travelers. The weather was good enough to fly, but the crew were working under time pressure to get out on schedule. That night, air traffic control assigned a different runway than the crew had originally originally planned for. In the cockpit, they had to redo their calculations and set up the airplane for a different length and heading while already taxiing. It added workload at a time when they also needed to focus on the basics, following the taxi route, completing checklists, and configuring the airplane for takeoff. The cockpit voice recorder later revealed something central to the investigation. The crew never properly completed the taxi checklist. They never reached the part that called for setting and verifying the flaps and slats. Those movable surfaces on the wings are critical. Extending them changes the shape of the wing and lets a heavy jet lift off safely at lower speed. Without them, the airplane needs much more runway and much more airspeed to fly. The airplane's designers knew humans make mistakes, so they had built in a layer of protection, a takeoff warning system. If the pilots pushed the throttles forward with the airplane not properly configured, an unmistakable alarm was supposed to sound. On Flight 255, that warning never came. For reasons that could not be fully determined later, the system that was supposed to be the last barrier against this exact error was quietly out of the game. At the runway, the flight was cleared for takeoff. The first officer advanced the throttles and the airplane began to accelerate, nose pointed into the darkening sky. To people watching from nearby roads, the picture was more troubling. The takeoff roll seemed longer than usual. The climb seemed shallower. The MD-82 rotated and lifted off near the far end of the runway. With flaps and slats still retracted, the wings had to work much harder to keep flying. The airplane began to rock from side to side as the pilots fought to keep control. About 50 feet above the ground, the jet crossed beyond the runway, heading toward the lights of the airport perimeter. Roughly 2,700 feet past the end of the runway, the left wing struck a light pole in a rental car lot. The impact tore open the wing and spilled fuel, which ignited. Moments later, the damaged wing hit the roof of a car rental building. Now badly crippled and burning, the airplane rolled further left, inverted, and dropped toward the road below. The jet hit the ground upside down, striking vehicles and tearing through a light industrial area beside the airport. Fire consumed what was left. Of the 155 people on the airplane, only one survived, a 4-year-old girl seated near the rear. 2 people on the ground were also killed. The investigation needed to answer a basic question. Why had a modern jet on a long paved runway failed to climb? Examination showed that at the moment of takeoff, the flaps and slats had never been extended. The airplane had tried to fly in a configuration completely wrong for its weight, and the cockpit voice recorder confirmed no warning ever sounded. The board found clear evidence that the crew had skipped their checklists and failed to set the flaps. They also found that the warning system never activated because electrical power to it was interrupted. The exact reason could not be conclusively proved. Investigators found signs that some crews pulled a circuit breaker to silence nuisance warnings during taxi, but they could not say with certainty what happened in this cockpit. What they could say was that the last safeguard, the one designed to shout when humans forget something, stayed silent. The probable cause, the crew's failure to use the checklist and set the flaps for takeoff, with the loss of power to the warning system as a critical contributing factor. After Detroit, airlines reinforced checklist discipline. Manufacturers redesigned warning systems to be harder to disable, and the image of that 4-year-old girl, the only survivor pulled from the wreckage, became a permanent reminder of how small deviations from basic procedures can end in catastrophe. Chicago Midway is not like other airports. The runways are short, boxed in by houses, streets, and shops on every side. There is almost no room for error. And on the evening of December 8, 2005, there was none. Southwest Flight 1248, a Boeing 737 with 103 people on board, was coming in from Baltimore. Snow was falling and winds were gusting. The crew faced a choice: land into the wind on a longer runway they could not use because of low visibility, or land with a tailwind on runway 3, just 6,500 feet of pavement pointed toward the city. The performance computer said the numbers worked. On paper, if they touched down in the right zone and used maximum braking and prompt reverse thrust, they would stop in time. The crew selected the auto brake system at its maximum setting. For them, this was the first real-world use of that feature in bad conditions. Auto brake is supposed to make life easier. It applies the brakes automatically after touchdown so the pilots can focus on keeping the airplane straight. But on this night, it became one more thing to manage during a demanding landing. The plane touched down in the normal zone with about 4,500 feet of runway remaining. The auto brakes engaged, spoilers deployed. What did not happen was the thing their math had silently assumed: immediate, full reverse thrust. In the cockpit, the pilots were watching the rollout, feeling for grip on the snowy surface, confirming what the auto brake was doing. Instead of going straight to full reverse, They hesitated. Those lost seconds did not feel dramatic. As the plane rolled on, it burned through every margin it had. By the time the pilots brought the reversers up, they were running out of concrete. The airplane crossed the far runway markings, still moving too fast to stop. There was no long safety zone ahead, only a blast fence, a chain-link boundary fence, and then Central Avenue, a busy city street. The jet broke through both fences, rode up over the curb, and slid into traffic. Cars waiting at a red light suddenly had a 737 coming toward them. The airplane struck several vehicles before coming to rest, nose on the roadway, cabin lights still glowing in the snow. Inside the jet, there was damage and minor injuries, but no fire. Passengers and crew began evacuating onto the street and snowbanks. Everyone on the airplane survived, but in one of the cars, a 6-year-old boy was killed. His family had not chosen to board a flight that night. They were just driving through their neighborhood. The investigation found no hidden failure in the brakes or reversers. The airplane had more than enough stopping power for the distance available, if the crew had used it the way the calculations assumed. The pilot's delay in applying full reverse thrust was the direct reason the jet could not stop. But around that finding was a wider ring of problems. The airline's guidance on tailwind landings was complex and unclear. The performance computer did not highlight the assumptions it was making. New auto-brake procedures had been introduced without enough training time, and Midway itself, an airport that predated modern safety standards, had no engineered arrestor bed to catch an overrun. After this accident, Midway installed arrestor systems where the city's tight footprint allowed. Regulators pushed for better overrun protection at landlocked airports across the country, and airlines began new work on how pilots think about contaminated runways and how performance calculations are built. On the afternoon of May 25, 1979, American Airlines Flight 191 taxied out at Chicago O'Hare like hundreds of other departures that day. The DC-10 was full, 258 passengers and 13 crew heading to Los Angeles at the start of a long weekend. Weather was clear, visibility was good. Nothing visible on the ramp hinted that this would become the deadliest aviation accident in United States history. The flight was cleared for takeoff. The crew rolled onto the centerline and advanced the throttles. The DC-10 began to accelerate, its 3 engines pulling hard. As the first officer eased back on the control column to lift the nose, the entire left engine and its mounting pylon broke away from the airplane. The combined structure tore a section of the wing's leading edge as it went, flipped up and over the top of the wing, then fell to the runway behind the jet. From the tower and from the ground, witnesses saw a sudden burst of debris and a long white trail behind the left wing. The damage inside the wing mattered more than the missing engine itself. When the pylon tore away, it ruptured hydraulic lines that kept the leading edge slats on that wing locked forward. The right wing still had its slats extended and full power. The left wing now had a chunk missing and slats retracted, which raised its stall speed far above what the crew believed they were safely flying at. To make matters worse, the electrical system powered by that engine went dead the moment it departed. From the outside, the next half-minute was captured in a single famous photograph, the DC-10 climbing shallowly. Left engine missing, a long streak of fuel trailing from the wing, the airplane slowly rolling left. The crew followed the standard procedure for an engine failure, holding takeoff speed and trying to climb away. They could not know that the left wing was already beyond its real stall margin. As the jet reached about 300 feet, the damaged wing could no longer carry its share of weight. Lift on the left side collapsed. The airplane rolled through 30 degrees of bank, then 60, then beyond 90 until it was almost on its side, nose dropping. There was no room to recover. About 4,600 feet beyond the runway, the DC-10 slammed into an open field near a trailer park. The impact and fire from nearly full fuel tanks destroyed everything. All 271 people on board were killed, along with 2 people on the ground. Firefighters found very little of the airframe intact, only the tail and some engine parts recognizable amid the crater and burning debris. Investigators quickly confirmed that the engine had not simply fallen off due to some hidden crack. On the runway, they found the entire engine and pylon sitting relatively intact. Examination of the attach points showed a distinctive kind of damage, metal bent and cracked in a way that only made sense if the pylon had been pushed against the wing with the bolts removed, the weight supported by something other than the airplane itself. That pointed to maintenance. At American's facility in Tulsa, mechanics had developed a shortcut. Instead of removing the engine and pylons separately, as the manufacturer recommended, they took both off together using a forklift. It saved time and money, but any small misalignment could load the attach points in ways they were never designed to handle. During one of those removals on this very airplane, contact between the fittings had created a crack. Over thousands of flights, it slowly grew, until that takeoff at O'Hare finished what the shortcut had started. The investigation named improper maintenance as the root cause. American Airlines was criticized for adopting the procedure without analyzing the risks. Federal regulators were criticized for not detecting or stopping it. Emergency inspections of other DC-10s found similar cracking at multiple airlines. On the evening of February 1st, 1991, Los Angeles International Airport was in a familiar rhythm. U.S. Air Flight 1493, a 737 from Columbus, was descending toward the city, cleared to land on runway 24 left. On the ground, SkyWest Flight 5569, a small Metroliner commuter turboprop, was taxiing out for a short hop to Palmdale. Both flights were routine. Neither would leave the runway alive. The commuter crew were first into position. The local controller cleared them to taxi onto the runway and hold. The Metroliner lined up on the center line and stopped, facing west into the night, waiting for takeoff clearance. From the cockpit of a big jet on approach, that small airplane would be almost impossible to see. In the tower, controller Robin Washer had several things pulling at her attention. Another commuter plane that had just landed needed to cross the runway, but its crew had switched frequencies too early. She kept trying to raise them, juggling other traffic and the paper strips that showed which airplanes were where. Somewhere in that process, the strip for the Metroliner was placed in the wrong bay, in the spot used for airplanes that had already departed. On paper, it no longer existed on the runway. At that moment, the inbound jet was handed to her on final approach, landing lights cutting through the darkness. Believing the runway was clear, she did something no controller is ever supposed to do. She cleared the landing on a runway that already had another airplane sitting on it. On the runway, the commuter crew waited for a takeoff clearance that never came. Above, the arriving crew flew the final approach. Neither knew there was an airplane ahead. The airport's surface radar was out of service. From the cockpit, the lights of the runway and terminal formed a bright curtain of glare. A slim commuter plane viewed from behind was almost invisible. The jet touched down normally. Only then did the first officer, lowering the nose, glimpse something solid and wrong on the center line ahead. He had seconds. He got on the brakes, but there was no time to turn or go around. The plane plowed straight into the Metroliner at high speed. The collision crushed the smaller airplane under the jet's belly. The commuter was torn apart, scattering fuel and wreckage across the runway. All 12 people on board were killed instantly. The jet rode up and over, skidding down the runway with the remains caught underneath, then veered off the pavement and slammed into an abandoned fire station building. The impact crushed the nose and cockpit. Fire followed quickly. Fuel from both airplanes fed a blaze around the front of the wreckage. Smoke and heat poured into the cabin. Passengers in the forward rows took the worst of it. Many who died did so not from impact but from smoke and fire in those first minutes. Evacuation was chaotic. The front doors could not be opened. Flight attendants directed people to the overwing exits and the rear. The pattern of injuries told the story. Almost everyone ahead of the wing was killed or badly hurt, while passengers behind row 17 largely escaped. In the end, 23 of the 89 people on the jet died. Combined with the 12 on the commuter, the collision killed 35 people. The investigation found no mechanical fault in either airplane. The core of the problem was in the tower. The board concluded that the controller's failure to maintain awareness led her to clear a landing on an occupied runway. The out-of-service radar, the misplaced flight strip, and the unresponsive commuter were all contributing factors. After Los Angeles, airports accelerated the installation of ground radar systems that show every aircraft on the surface. Tower procedures were rewritten to require positive confirmation before clearing any runway. And the industry learned, again, that a single distracted moment in a control tower can put two airplanes on a collision course that neither crew can see coming. By late evening on June 1st, 1999, American Airlines Flight 1420 was racing the clock and the weather. The MD-82 had spent the day moving around the country and was now running late on a short hop from Dallas-Fort Worth to Little Rock. Both pilots were near the end of a long duty day and knew that if they did not depart by a certain time, company rules would force the flight to be canceled. Thunderstorms were flaring across Arkansas, with lightning showing on the radar and out the cockpit windows. Still, when Little Rock came into range, the crew chose to press on, hoping to land before the worst of the storm moved directly over the airport. Controllers first planned to bring them in on a southbound runway with a tailwind. As the storm shifted, the wind swung around, and the tower offered the opposite direction, runway 4 right, which would give them a headwind. On paper, this was the safer choice. The problem was that the airplane was already close. The storm was nearly overhead, and the new approach required a tight turn and a rushed setup. The crew accepted anyway. As they maneuvered, heavy rain moved across the field. Wind shear alerts sounded in the tower. Controllers read out winds that exceeded the company's own crosswind limits for landing on a wet runway at night. There were solid options available: hold, divert, return to Dallas. Instead, under the pressure of fatigue and schedule, they pressed on. In the cockpit, their focus narrowed to getting in before the field went below minimums. The rushed feeling showed up most clearly in the checklist. As they turned onto final, the crew never completed the before-landing checklist. They did not arm the automatic spoiler system, the panels that pop up on touchdown to dump lift and put weight on the wheels. They did not set the auto brakes. Only late in the descent did they realize the flaps were not at the right setting and quickly corrected. By the time they were lined up, catching up with the airplane had become more important than asking whether this was still a landing they should attempt. The final approach was unstable. Wind shifts pushed the jet above and below the glide path. Rain reduced visibility. The crew pressed on, making small corrections, driven by the idea that they were already committed. When the wheels finally touched runway 4 right, it was further along than planned, leaving less pavement to work with. The spoilers stayed down because they had never been armed. Without that extra weight on the wheels, the brakes could not bite into the wet surface. Now the jet was on the ground, moving fast in a severe thunderstorm with a strong crosswind, and missing 2 of its key stopping aids. The captain applied manual braking and pulled the thrust levers into reverse. But on this airplane, high reverse thrust can steal effectiveness from the tail surfaces that keep the nose straight, especially on a slick runway. That is exactly what happened. The combination of wet pavement, crosswind, and strong reverse made it impossible to hold the center line. Directional control slipped away at the moment when there was no room left for error. The aircraft ran off the end of the runway, still traveling far too fast. Beyond the painted markings, there was no generous safety zone. Only grass, a fence, and then the metal structure supporting the instrument landing system for the opposite runway. A rigid array built on the riverbank that did not shear off like modern frangible supports. The jet plowed through the fence and into that structure. The impact tore the front of the airplane apart. The nose and left side of the forward fuselage were crushed. The MD-82 broke into several pieces and came to rest in the dark, rain-soaked approach area, short of the Arkansas River. 11 people died, including the captain. More than 100 others were injured, but most survived and evacuated into the storm, with the help of flight attendants and rescuers. The wreckage, sitting at the edge of the river with runway lights still burning behind it, became one of the starkest pictures of how a landing that should have been waved off can end when all the margins are gone at once. The investigation went well beyond a single bad decision. The board concluded that the probable cause was the crew's failure to discontinue the approach when a severe thunderstorm had moved over the airport, combined with their failure to ensure the spoilers deployed, which greatly reduced braking on the wet runway. Underneath that, fatigue, time pressure, inadequate training on thunderstorm risks, and the decision to continue even after conditions exceeded published limits. Investigators also pointed out that the solid, non-breakaway structure beyond the runway made the consequences far worse than they might have been at an airport with a proper safety area. On March 5, 2015, Delta Airlines Flight 1086 lined up for landing at New York's LaGuardia Airport after a short flight from Atlanta. The MD-88 carried 132 people. Outside, a late winter storm had left New York coated in snow and slush. Crews had been plowing and sweeping the runways, but conditions were changing by the minute. LaGuardia is known for short runways and tight margins even on a dry day. On that morning, every inch of pavement mattered. The runway in use pointed out over Flushing Bay, surrounded by water and concrete, with a berm and fence at the far end instead of a wide safety zone. The weather was marginal but legal. Light snow, gusty winds, poor braking reports from earlier landings. Just before the Delta flight arrived, another aircraft had given the tower a mixed report about how slippery the surface felt. In the cockpit, the pilots discussed the conditions and decided to continue. On final approach, the jet broke out of the clouds with the runway in sight. Snowbanks lined the sides of the pavement. Touchdown came near the aiming markers. For a moment, everything looked normal. The main wheels contacted the wet, snowy surface. Spoilers deployed. The nose began to lower. The critical seconds came next. As the nose wheel came down, the captain brought the thrust levers into reverse, then quickly advanced them to a high setting. On this airplane, reverse thrust comes from the tail-mounted engines. When those engines are at high reverse power on a slippery surface, the airflow can wash over the tail and reduce the effectiveness of the rudder, the surface that keeps the airplane pointed straight. It can also reduce the weight on the nose wheel, making steering harder. Almost immediately, the MD-88 began to drift and yaw to the left. The captain added right rudder and tried to correct with nose wheel steering, but the airplane kept sliding. The combination of a crosswind from the left, a contaminated surface, and high reverse thrust had overpowered the available directional control. The jet crossed the center line and headed toward the left edge of the runway, still moving at high speed. There was no time for a go-around. The airplane skidded off the runway, plowing through the snowbank and onto the grassy area between the pavement and the bay. It struck the airport perimeter fence, tore through it, and slid up onto the earthen berm separating the airfield from the water. When it stopped, the nose was hanging just short of the icy edge above Flushing Bay, tilted at an angle, with one wing partly over the water. Inside the cabin, the slide off the runway threw passengers against seatbacks and sidewalls. Overhead bins popped open, but there was no fire. Flight attendants assessed which exits were usable. Some were blocked by snow and debris. On the right side, slides deployed onto the grass. Passengers evacuated into the cold wind, some in stocking feet. Emergency vehicles arrived within minutes. Remarkably, there were no fatalities. 24 people received minor injuries. The airplane was written off. Photographs of the MD-88 perched beside the bay, nose near the water, became one of the most striking images of a runway excursion in modern American aviation. The investigation found that the runway had patchy contamination, areas of snow, slush, and chemically treated surface with variable friction. But other aircraft had landed without incident around the same time. The key findings centered on reverse thrust. At high reverse settings, the MD-88's tail-mounted engines can reduce the effectiveness of rudder and nosewheel steering, especially in a crosswind. The captain had selected reverse thrust levels significantly above what was needed. In those conditions, contaminated surface, crosswind from the left, this made it much easier for the airplane to slide sideways and much harder for steering inputs to work. The probable cause? The captain's use of excessive reverse thrust on a contaminated runway, which degraded directional control. After LaGuardia, airlines updated their guidance on reverse thrust use in slippery conditions. A reminder that even an experienced crew on a runway they know well can lose control in seconds when the wrong technique meets the wrong surface. On December 3, 1990, Detroit Metropolitan Airport sat under a lid of cold, dirty fog. Visibility was down to a quarter mile. Through that gray soup, 2 Northwest Airlines jets were getting ready to leave. A DC-9 as Flight 1482 to Pittsburgh, and a 727 as Flight 299 to Memphis. The DC-9 pushed back first with 44 people on board. Ground control cleared the crew along a series of taxiways toward Runway 3 Center, a route that, on a clear day, would have been simple. In dense fog at an airport with crisscrossing concrete and faded markings, it was a much harder task. From the beginning, the crew struggled to match what they saw outside with the diagram in front of them. They had trouble staying on the painted center line. When they came to a taxiway sign, they misread the situation and turned onto the wrong path. In their radio calls, they sounded confident, but their description of where they were did not fit the actual layout of the field. The ground controller, working without ground radar, tried to recover the situation. He gave them a new plan: continue to the next intersection, then turn right. On paper, that would bring them back toward the runway. In reality, that intersection was a known problem even in good weather. Confusing geometry and worn paint. In the fog, with a crew already disoriented, it was the worst place on the field. As the DC-9 rolled forward, the captain kept asking his first officer to confirm where they were. The first officer gave answers that matched the clearance more than the reality. When they reached the intersection, they missed the tight right turn, and instead followed a gentler curve, directly toward active Runway 3 Center. A yellow hold line appeared out of the fog, but the crew thought they were looking at a closed runway they were authorized to cross. The captain hesitated, even asking out loud whether this might be the active runway. The first officer reassured him it was not. They rolled forward and turned right. Now they were tracking along Runway 3 Center itself, facing opposite to the normal flow of departures. The markings and lights did not match what they expected. The captain pulled over to the left edge of the pavement and stopped, uneasy. He told his first officer to call ground and say they were stuck. On the frequency, there was a brief, confused back and forth. When the crew finally said they believed they were on Runway 3 Center, the controller realized the worst. A DC-9 was sitting on an active runway in almost zero visibility. His response was immediate. He told them to exit at once. In the tower, supervisors shouted for all aircraft to stop. But it was too late. At the far end of the runway, the 727 had already been cleared for takeoff and was accelerating through the fog. In the DC-9 cockpit, only seconds passed between the order to exit and the first sight of danger. Through the murk, the crew saw landing lights and a large shape bearing down on them. They had no time to move. At about 100 knots, the 727's right wing sliced into the DC-9 just below the windows, then cut backward through the cabin and into the tail engine. The smaller jet erupted in fire. The larger plane, badly damaged but controllable, rejected the takeoff and stopped further down the runway. For the people on the DC-9, the next minutes were a fight to survive. The impact killed several passengers instantly. Flames and thick smoke poured into the cabin. Some exits were blocked by heat and wreckage. Passengers and crew who could move made it to the overwing exits and the main door, helping each other onto the wet pavement as fire grew behind them. Emergency crews, working in the same fog, initially headed toward the 727. It took precious minutes to locate the DC-9 sitting off to one side, already engulfed in flames. 8 of the 44 people on board died. On the other aircraft, all 154 survived. The investigation found no single failure, but a chain. The probable cause was the DC-9 crew's failure to maintain awareness of where they were on the field. Contributing factors: the controller's inability to detect the error in time, confusing layout and poor markings at the intersection, the lack of ground radar, and a breakdown in communication when someone finally admitted, "We can't see anything out here." After Detroit, airports accelerated the installation of ground surveillance radar. Taxiway markings and signage were redesigned nationwide. And the industry learned that in low visibility, a single wrong turn can put one airplane directly in the path of another, with only seconds to react. On July 6, 2013, Asiana Airlines Flight 214 came gliding in toward San Francisco at the end of a long overnight flight from Seoul. The Boeing 777 had 307 people on board and had crossed the Pacific without a single technical problem. It was a clear summer morning. The water of the bay was bright, the hills were sharp. For many passengers, this was their first view of California. No one expected that the last minute of that flight would become one of the most closely studied runway accidents in modern aviation. That summer, a piece of equipment on the main landing runway was out of service. The vertical beam of the instrument landing system, the radio signal that tells pilots exactly how high they should be on final approach, had been turned off for work. Pilots were still allowed to land, but they had to treat it as a visual approach. This is not unusual on a clear day, but it demands that someone in the cockpit constantly watch both the glide path and the speed, especially in the last mile. In the cockpit were 3 pilots, a trainee captain making one of his first landings in the 777 at San Francisco, an instructor captain supervising him, and a relief first officer in the jump seat. The trainee was flying. The instructor thought he had set up the automation so that the auto throttle, the system that adjusts engine thrust to hold a selected speed, would keep the jet near the proper approach speed. In reality, due to a combination of mode selections, the auto throttle had dropped into a hold mode. The thrust levers sat at idle and stayed there. At first, nothing looked obviously wrong. The jet turned onto final over the bay and lined up with the runway. Air traffic control cleared them to land. But as they came closer, small deviations started to build. The airplane sank below the ideal path, and the speed began to bleed away. The relief pilot called out that they were low. The instructor saw the picture looking wrong and tried to coach the trainee back. But no one took firm control and called for a go-around while there was still time. As the jet crossed the shoreline, just seconds from the runway, the airspeed had decayed far below what it should have been, about 34 knots slower than target. The stick shaker, the device that warns of an approaching stall, activated 4 seconds before impact. Only 1.5 seconds before the crash did someone finally call for a go-around. The pilots shoved the thrust levers forward, but big engines take several seconds to spool up. Time had run out. Just short of the concrete, the main landing gear and then the tail struck the seawall at the approach end of the runway. The impact ripped the tail section off the airplane. The left engine and main gear separated. The rest of the fuselage pitched and yawed violently, then slid and spun along the runway, shedding pieces as it went. Inside, seats broke loose, overhead bins opened, passengers were thrown around. 4 flight attendants strapped into jump seats in the tail were hurled out onto the runway when the tail tore away. The wrecked fuselage came to rest in the infield with a broken, burned rear section. Fire broke out along the right side. Some emergency slides deployed normally. 2 malfunctioned and inflated inside the cabin. One pinned a flight attendant to the floor until a pilot cut it with a tool. Despite the chaos, crew members moved quickly, directing passengers away from burning areas and toward usable exits. 3 people died. 2 passengers were found outside the airplane after being ejected. A third died later in the hospital. About 187 others were injured, 49 seriously. Remarkably, more than 300 people survived a crash in which a wide-body jet had hit a seawall and broken apart. The investigation found no unusual weather, no structural failure, no engine problem. The 777 had responded as designed. The core problem was how the approach had been flown. The board concluded that the probable cause was the crew's mismanagement of the final approach, their failure to monitor airspeed and glide path, and their reliance on an auto-throttle mode they did not fully understand. After San Francisco, airlines around the world reinforced training on manual flying skills and automation awareness. The crash became a case study in what happens when pilots trust the computers to do something the computers are not actually doing, and no one notices until the runway is seconds away. Most passengers never think twice about the strip of concrete under the wheels. The drama of flying seems to live in the climb through the clouds and the long hours over the ocean. Yet in every story you have just heard, the most dangerous seconds happened within a few hundred meters of a runway threshold, at speeds where there was no time left to fix a mistake. At Chicago Midway, a jet that rolled through the fence and into a city street showed how a few seconds of delay with reverse thrust can erase every line of performance math. At Little Rock, an airplane that ran off the end of the runway into the riverbank made it painfully clear that no arrival is worth pushing a wet runway and a thunderstorm past the limits written in the manual. In Lexington and Los Angeles and Detroit, collisions on the ground exposed a different weakness: how easy it is for a controller to lose track, or for a crew to convince themselves they know where they are, until 2 airplanes are sharing the same piece of concrete without realizing it. In Chicago in 1979 and Detroit in 1987, the disasters began at the moment when the nose should have left the runway. One airplane had been weakened months earlier by a maintenance shortcut no one could see. Another tried to fly with its wings still in clean configuration because a checklist was rushed and a warning system stayed silent. At San Francisco and LaGuardia, modern jets reminded everyone that technology does not cancel physics. One crew let speed and height bleed away on a clear morning until the tail met the seawall. Another used more reverse thrust than the slippery runway could handle, and discovered that stopping power is useless if you can no longer keep the nose pointed straight. At Willow Run, a windstorm days before the flight jammed a flight control in a way no cockpit check could detect. When the crew tried to rotate and nothing happened, their only choices were a high-speed reject or an attempt to fly a jet that did not want to leave the ground. The ruined landing gear at the far end of that runway is proof that the decision to stay on the ground saved more than 100 lives. Taken together, these accidents changed the way American aviation thinks about concrete. They pushed airports to add runway safety areas and engineered arrestor beds, so that an overrun ends in crushed foam instead of streets and houses. They drove the installation of ground radar and surface alert systems, so controllers can see when an airplane is turning the wrong way in the fog. They led to clearer signs and paint at intersections, stricter phraseology for clearances, and stricter rules on sterile cockpit discipline. Airlines rewrote their procedures for contaminated runways, tailwinds, and crosswinds, and invested more in training crews to go around or divert instead of trying to salvage a bad approach. Manufacturers changed designs so that a shortcut in a hangar or a gust on the ramp cannot silently load a takeoff with a hidden failure. For passengers, the result is something you never see. You feel it only as a slightly firmer landing, an unexpected go-around, a few extra minutes holding for weather, or a taxi route that seems overly cautious on a clear night. Behind those small annoyances is a long history of broken fences, bruised metal at runway ends, and investigation reports that pulled apart every second between the threshold and the lights at the far end. The crashes in this film are part of that history. Their victims will never step onto an airplane again. But the lessons taken from their flights now sit quietly behind every clearance to line up and wait. Every cross-check of a heading before takeoff, and every decision to change runways when the conditions get worse. If you have stayed with this story to the end and you want more calm, detailed documentaries about how real flights change the way we travel, subscribe to Terra Obscura, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which incident, aircraft or airport you would like to explore next.